Welcome to a quick introduction of the Invoke library. This is a route authentication and authorization management library. That's kind of a mouthful, but what basically it is a system that looks at the currently requested path on a web application and then makes comparisons against whether it's protected or not, and then checks the current user to see if it needs to be protected in any way, checking for groups, checking for permissions, that kind of thing. I just wanted to get a quick overview of how to use the library. Because it is a little bit more on the web side of things, I'm going to go ahead and set up a simple Slim application and just require it through Composer here. You can see that the two requirements are Slim and Invoke. If you haven't used the Slim framework before, it's just a simple micro framework that as of version 3 they kind of re-released with PSR7 support. If you're not familiar with the PSR7 structure, it's essentially just a structure that more clearly defines HTTP request and response objects so that those can be standardized a little bit more. Most of the frameworks that are re-implementing with PSR7 support are also including middleware support that kind of follows that same structure. So you can see there's just some basic requirements for Slim there. Now we'll go and include the Invoke library and get that installed here. There is a dependency on the Symfony YAML component right now. Essentially that just parses the YAML file, the configuration file. That's a little heavy for what is necessarily needed, but it's one of the simplest ones to use, and it's pretty well tested, pretty well structured. So I went ahead and created some of the bootstrap stuff ahead of time, just so that I'm not necessarily walking through the actual use of the Slim application and getting into all that. The basics of it though is that I created my new Slim app here, and then I created the basic endpoint. This is just the regular endpoint for it, the default route. And then what I did was set up this localhost domain so that I could load that up. Now again, I said that this is a little bit more of a web-facing library, so it makes a little bit more sense to have the website set up there. Basically all it does here is it echoes index. It doesn't really matter what's in here to invoke. This is just your logic and whatever happens inside of your functionality. You'll see that we add some other stuff in here in a little bit that makes it work with the framework so that you don't have to add this checking on every single route in your application. You can just kind of do it globally. And then this last line here just runs the Slim app. There's an htaccess file that redirects everything back to the index.php. Most frameworks use this kind of thing just to remove the index.php file from the URL over here. So it looks a little cleaner and it kind of redirects it back in. So now how are we going to integrate Invoke into this structure? I mentioned previously that Slim, it follows the PSR7 standard and it does include middleware functionality. So I've already created a Invoke middleware here, and you can see it's just in the public directory. So I'm just going to go ahead and require this file. And then if we go look over here, this is where the Invoke functionality starts coming in. Here up at the top, we go ahead and include the enforcer and the resource through the use statement for the namespacing. This just makes it a little bit cleaner down here rather than having to define the full namespace on these two classes. So you can see the middleware structure here is the standard structure. This is how Slim defines its, so that it knows to call the invoke method here on the middleware, and you get a request response and then the next step in the middleware. In this case, we're going to grab the URI. This is actually grabbed off of the request, off of the URI object, and then the path is pulled from there. The next line is where the invoke functionality starts up. This is pulling in a configuration file, the routes YAML file. If you look over here, you can actually see this config directory. That's why that path is there. It goes up one and then comes back down into it. And then what happens in that YAML config file is that we are defining the default route here. This is just the the regular /route base route. And then we're defining it as being protected. So essentially what that does is it tells Invoke that it needs to be an authenticated user to be able to access that resource. So if we go back to our middleware, the actual check itself is done through this isAuthorized method. You'll see that the resource here is the resource that we mentioned up here. Resource in this case is just essentially an object representing the current path being accessed in the application. Then if you'll also notice, there's this invoke user. Now, this is an interface that you'll have to drop your user inside of and create kind of a wrapper class around it. This invoke user that I have over here just basically implements this user interface. Right now it just defines a get groups, a get permissions, and an isAuth method inside of that interface that you have to define. In this case, I'm just creating an invoke user and I'm passing in some information here, but since I don't have a constructor or anything on my class, it doesn't really matter. But that kind of gives you an idea of how you would pass in your specific user. This just kind of gives it a standardized interface, obviously the interface, to allow Invoke to pull out the information that it needs. Now, the get groups and get permissions are going to return arrays, and isAuth is a true or false. Now, if you'll notice, back on our routes here, there's the default route, and we set it as protected on. Essentially, what Invoke thinks when it sees this is that the subject, or the user that it's receiving, this new Invoke user, has to pass the isAuth check. So in this case in particular, I'm just returning true, hard-coded true, so that it thinks, yes, it's authorized, and it can access the route. So I'll go back in here to my main index page, my super simple index, and actually include this invoke user file that I've created. That's just basically so that the middleware here understands what an invoke user is, and then it can use that for the evaluation. In our checking here, we just output the result of allowed. In most applications, you're probably going to want to redirect to a not allowed page, or throw some kind of exception, throw some kind of error in this case right here. But for just example purposes, this is just outputting the result of the allowed. So if we go back over here to our simple application and reload, now that we actually have the middleware added in and it's executing at the start of each request, you'll see that we get a true added on here at the beginning. That's the output of this var export, so that we get the full Boolean value for it. So in this case, Invoke is just going through, checking the user, and it runs a parsing of the configuration, says, okay, the default route is protected. So then I need to go and look at my Invoke user and call that isAuth method. So for us, this is returning true, which makes the isAuth result come back and be allowed. So if we change this to false, and we go back over here and reload, you can see that this changes to false. Now, this is not a direct pass-through. It's not returning the results of this isAuth method, because there's all sorts of other checks that you can do inside of your configuration. But this is just a super basic one showing how you can check for an authenticated user. And that middleware is run at the start of each request, so it's run even before it hits your route and the logic inside of your route, so you don't have to necessarily call it inside of each route. And kind of the whole dry methodology where you don't repeat yourself throughout your application and have to go in and change things all over the place. If you update your routes and you update the protection that you need, you can just go ahead and update this route's configuration file, and it goes ahead and updates it across the entire application. If you'd like to find out more about the library, you can just go over to its GitHub repository, github.com/psecIO/invoke. There's lots of other functionality that it provides. You can check for groups and permissions like you saw in the Invoke user class. So it just kind of gives you a little bit extra ability on top of what you have in the current standard framework. Now, some of this stuff I mentioned is kind of built into the Symfony framework, but it's a little more complex. There's a lot more structure to what you can define in there. But this just kind of the basics and kind of gives you a little bit extra protection in your application. Hopefully you'll find this library useful. If you have any questions about this, go ahead and leave them in the comments, and I'm happy to answer them. Thanks.